History isn't boring. History teachers are boring. Right? You all know that I love history. But I have to admit that some accounts of history are mind-numbingly boring. I think it's criminal to reduce these fascinating stories of the past to just dates and hard-to-pronounce names. History is drama. It is intrigue. It's filled with the very best stories of courage and cowardice, loyalty and betrayal, strength, weakness, wisdom, and incredible folly. I say that because inserted in the very middle of a detailed prophecy in the Bible, maybe the most detailed prophecy in all of Scripture, we find an amazing statement about courage and great deeds. And so, folks, listen, settle in this morning because you're in for a history lesson. It's history for us, but it was prophecy of the future for Daniel, to whom it was given. In chapters 11 and 12 of Daniel, we get a detailed sketch of what will take place about 130 years forward from Daniel's time, but then it jumps out to the very end of time. What we are going to read today took place over 100 years forward for Daniel, but it's over 2,000 years in our rearview mirror. So detailed is this prophecy that for years, skeptics said it had to have been written after it happened. And then they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid-20th century and realized, oh no, this was actually prophecy. He wrote about this before it happened. And these chapters, an angel, most likely the angel Gabriel, tells Daniel what's coming in Israel's future. And that future is split between a near future and then a very distant future. In verse 36 of chapter 11, it goes from the nearer prophecy, again, about 130 years in Daniel's future, and it jumps way out to the end times. Because the events of the nearer prophecy are a template of what's going to happen at the end of times, this is a good place to remind us all of what real prophecy is. In the Bible, prophecy is not a simple foretelling of the future and then some one-time future fulfillment. In the Bible, prophecy is a foretelling of the future, a big span. There is some ultimate fulfillment, but throughout history, we get little pictures of what that ultimate fulfillment will look like by these individual steps along the way. You follow? So what we are seeing in this passage of Scripture is as Daniel looks into the future, he sees the future of Israel and he sees the career of a really wicked guy. Incredibly wicked. But he becomes a picture, a forecast, if you will, of an even more diabolical leader at the end of times that we know as the Antichrist. Now, we're going to drill down this morning into something that we find at the very end of the nearer prophecy. So we need to take a walk through verses 29 through 32, and to make sense of it, because it's so detailed, excuse me, but I'm going to chop it up and explain each section, okay? So here we go, verse 29. At the appointed time, he shall return and go toward the south. Well, this is the future to Daniel. It's history to us. We know who the he is here in verse 29. This is a guy known as Antiochus IV. He's the king of the Seleucid Empire, which was based in Syria, just to the northeast of Israel. Now, I'm going to simplify that. Instead of referring it to as the Seleucid Empire, let's just call it Syria, okay? Syria at this time, that's being prophesied, was locked in a contest, a very long-running contest with Egypt. So you have Syria to the north of Israel, you have Egypt to the south of Israel, and these two are at odds with each other. They're in a decades-long contest to try to conquer each other. Now, hold on. Syria to the north of Israel, Egypt to the south of Israel. Who's between them? Israel. And so can you see how the border between these two keeps going back and forth? Whichever side is dominant, the border goes either north or south. And so who ends up being the battleground for this contest? The land of Israel. Well, the angel tells Daniel of a time when the Syrian king, who we know as Antiochus IV, will push the Egyptians back to Egypt. And friends, that's exactly what happened. In 168 BC, Antiochus amassed a huge army and marched all the way into Egypt. Syria was about to be the winner in the long contest between these two rivals. The last of the Egyptian forces, what was left of their government, was now reduced to one city, the city of Alexandria. And he's about to conquer them. End of verse 29. But it shall not be like the former or the later. The contest ended, but not as either Syria or Egypt assumed that it would. Remember, up till now, they've been going back and forth and back and forth. It looks like it's about to be over with Syria winning. But it turns out very differently. Another player steps onto the stage at this point, verse 30. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Enter Rome. The Egyptians had foreseen that the next time Antiochus invaded, the Syrians would win. They just understood they were too weak to resist. And so they had appealed to the emerging power in the area, Rome. The Romans had already defeated Antiochus's father. Several years before, Antiochus had marched an army across, intending to go into Greece, and the Romans were there and had stopped them and had utterly whooped the Syrians. And then placed a huge fine on them. And they haven't paid it yet. And that's one of the reasons Antiochus IV is trying to conquer Egypt, so he can get all of their wealth and pay that fine that the Romans had levied on him. Antiochus did not want to tangle with the Romans again. And so when they arrive with their fleet from Cyprus, they send a message to him. Remember, the last of the Egyptians are in Alexandria. Here's the Syrian forces getting ready to lay siege. You got the picture? The Romans have just arrived, and they send a message. They want to parley with Antiochus. And he says, I better say yes, because I don't want to tangle with the Romans. Okay, I'll parley with you. One Roman official shows up, one guy. Talk about bold. He's dressed in his armor, and he shows up and he hands Antiochus a letter. It's from the Roman Senate. And it says, Egypt is now our ally. If you attack, you go to war with us. So Antiochus says, can I have some time to take this to my advisors and think about it? And the Roman official, this is so funny, he takes his riding crop and he just walks around Antiochus and he draws a circle on the ground. And he says, you have till you step out of that circle to give me an answer. You step out of that circle, it's war. And Antiochus says, okay, we give, uncle. And so the Syrians now, they submit to Rome. Antiochus knew this was the end of his ambition to do what his ancestors had been unable to, conquer Egypt. And that grated on him. You see, Antiochus fancied himself the reincarnation of Alexander the Great. He had taken to himself the title Epiphanes, which means the illustrious one. It was a claim to deity. Well, now, Mr. Signor Illustrious has been humiliated. The humiliated egomaniac is dangerous. And that leads us to the last part of verse 30. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against what? The holy covenant, and do damage. So here's Antiochus now. He's been backed down by the Romans. He has to lead his armies. These armies, that he's been promising all the wealth of Egypt to. He marches home like a spoiled brat, doing what bullies often do. He's been backed down by a bigger bully, and so what does he do? He takes out his anger on someone smaller and weaker. So you tell me, whose land is he marching through as he's going home? Israel. And he decides to take out his wrath on the Jews. Because he fancied himself Alexander reborn, Antiochus wanted to make the world Greek. Even those that didn't want to be, he was determined, listen, I'm going to make you Greek. All but a handful of Jews resisted him. And remember, they've recently returned from exile in Babylon, where they had been permanently cured of idolatry. That was the problem and why they had gone into captivity to begin with, because of their worship of idols. And the 70 years they spent in Babylon had forever cured the Jews of idolatry. There's never been a problem since. But it did make them fiercely loyal to what? The God of Israel and his word. The synagogues were born in Babylon, and they brought them back. Now there are places all over Israel where people can go to study the word of God. They're deeply, fanatically loyal to Yahweh, to their one God. They'll not worship idols, and they are going to obey Moses. So here comes Antiochus, demanding that they worship idols. When they resisted, he took it as a personal insult, and he moved to make them comply. He executed resistors while rewarding those that capitulated. And yes, there were a small number of Jews that were all for going Greek. So Antiochus promoted them. He rewarded them by giving them financial gifts. And so the angel says, last part of verse 30, so he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. But there weren't enough of these Jewish turncoats. And so Antiochus ramped up his efforts to stamp out Judaism. Verse 31, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then he shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. When the Jews of Jerusalem proved themselves intractable, they refused his program to make them Greeks and worshiping the Greek gods. He sent 22,000 Syrian soldiers into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. They killed 40,000 Jews and took as many slaves. They looted the city, burned the buildings. And by royal decree, Antiochus forbade the Jews keeping the law of Moses. They were barred from observing the annual feasts. They were prohibited from celebrating Passover and Yom Kippur. Did you know that tomorrow, this evening, our time, actually, it'll be evening in Israel, which is right about now, they've started the celebration of Yom Kippur. Well, Antiochus said, no, you're not allowed to worship God. You're not allowed to observe the feast days. No more Passover, no more Yom Kippur. Imagine some tyrant taking over the United States and saying, no more Easter, no more Christmas. No more Halloween. Some of us might be like, yes. The Jews were prohibited from circumcising their sons. How do you think that's going to go down? No more observing of the Sabbath. The scriptures were burned. Anyone caught with God's word was executed. And then on December 16th of 167, Antiochus set up a statue to Zeus in front of the temple. And get this, to make sure he was sending the message of how much he hated the worship of God, he sacrificed a peg on the altar to God. Even the Jewish traders regarded that as too much, and they feared the result. All Jews held their breath to see if God would send lightning to destroy Antiochus and the Syrians. And when it didn't fall, those who had been kind of neutral, they joined the Let's Go Greek campaign. These were the wet-fingered folk, who decide what to do based on the way that the winds are blowing, the poles say. And so these people, they had said, well, I'm a Jew, I believe in Yahweh. But when they didn't see lightning fall in the face of this utter blasphemy, and when they saw that people that were going along with Antiochus' program were getting rewarded, they were getting promoted, they decided, that's the way to go. And we don't have to worry because God's not going to judge us. Look, no lightning has fallen. There's a lot of people that do that today. They know that the direction the world has taken is wrong, but God hasn't judged. No lightning has fallen. And there are rewards for going woke, and there are penalties for not. And so they climb aboard the woke bus. DEI and ESG and all these other acronyms. Well, look at verse 32. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. Flattery, excessive and insincere praise. It's funny because I did a little bit of study on this word flattery. The root word means slippery. You see, flattery is a setup for a scam. It's a way to slip in something we won't like by telling us something that we do. Antiochus said that those Jews who went along with his reforms were smarter, wiser, more sophisticated than those backward hicks who still believed in God. He promised them by going along with his plans that they'd progress and achieve a utopia. So they bought the lie. They took over Jerusalem, these turncoats, these traitors, these compromisers. And the faithful had to flee. And so they moved to Idaho, Tennessee, Texas, Florida. No, they fled to the Judean hills and the Judean wilderness, beyond the reach of the Syrian troops. It was from these loyalists a movement rose that saw the Syrians removed, the temple reclaimed, and the worship of God restored. We read of them in the last part of verse 32. Look at what it says there. Here we go. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. It began in the village of Modin, just northwest of Jerusalem. There was a priest by the name of Mattathias. Along with his 5 sons, they had left Jerusalem. They were now living in Modin. They had gotten away from the pressure to capitulate. And here they are in Modin when one day a squad of Syrian soldiers shows up to make sure the people of Modin comply with the new system, the new plan, the new program. They built an altar to Zeus and ordered that the people worship. When they realized that Mattathias was a priest, they ordered him to sacrifice a pig to Zeus. But Mattathias had had enough. He'd been forced to leave the city that he loved. He was heartsick at the way that the temple had been turned into a pagan shrine. And having nowhere else to go, nowhere left to run, he was done. He refused. He knew that his life was forfeit, but he would not compromise. So a younger priest rushed forward to offer the sacrifice, worried that the Syrian troops would be so upset at Mattathias' defiance that they would start killing everybody, him included. Mattathias said, no, we have to draw the line somewhere, and this is the place to draw it. He grabbed a dagger and he attacked the Syrians. Well, his sons saw that, and so they jumped in because they knew that they needed to protect their father. They subdued the Syrians. And then, of course, they had to run for the hills. They tore down the altar to Zeus, and they ran for the hills because they knew that the Syrians would be sending out a force to deal with them. What they didn't realize is that many others in Israel were just waiting for someone to stand up and say, that's enough. And many of them joined Mattathias' sons in the hills. They became known as the Maccabees. They were named after one of the sons. His name was Judas. He became kind of the leader. He was a brilliant tactician. And he kept defeating the Syrians. And so the army began to grow. They gave him the nickname the Hammer, Maccabee, and Judas Maccabeus. And their revolt became known as the Maccabean Revolt. The rebels destroyed dozens more altars in other villages. Antiochus refused to take the insurrection seriously. He kept just sending out small patrols to put it down, and they kept getting whooped. And the Maccabees defeated them all. Every victory saw more Jews joining their ranks. And so Antiochus finally had to send out the entire army. But by then the Maccabees were able to go toe-to-toe with them. They had learned the strategies, the tactics. They had become armed now with all the weapons that they had taken from the Syrians. And they defeated the Syrians, and the entire Syrian army presence had to leave Israel. and Israel became free for the next 100 years under the reign of the Maccabees' descendants, known as the Hasmoneans. They retook Jerusalem, they cleansed the temple, they rededicated it to the Lord. It's celebrated today as the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, is the celebration of the dedication of the temple. That daring revolt is foretold here in verse 32. Look at it again. The people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Friends, what was true then is true today. Real strength, true strength lies in knowing God. The word know in Hebrew is yada. It's the knowledge of experience. It's not book smarts. It's a personal encounter. It's the knowledge that comes from actually experiencing something. You know, a theologian can have a long list of very big words that describe who and what God is and yet not know God. Well, a farmer that has nothing but a Bible knows God because he talks with him every day, depending on him to cause his crops to grow. It's those who know God, not just about him, who are strong. And that word strong means to stand firm. That's what the word means. It means to resist. You can look it up. They shall resist. Mattathias knew God. When his fellow Jews compromised with Antiochus, he knew that it was wrong. When holding to that conviction was no longer possible in Jerusalem, he left. At Modin, when again challenged to compromise, he refused. And with no place left to go, he took a stand, a hard one. Friends, there comes a time when the people of God have to take a stand and say no to accommodation and compromise. When Mattathias did, his sons were the first to join him, and then more joined. Though they were outnumbered and underarmed, their faith opened a door for God to step through. One with God will always be more than the enemy. No matter how many they are, one with God is always more than the enemy. God doesn't need an army. He doesn't. He needs just one who knows him and puts what they know about him into practice. Isaiah 58 or 59 says, when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord will lift up a standard against him. What was true then is true now. History is filled with the tales of those who turned their knowledge of God into actions that brought about great victories. We think of Jonathan, the son of Saul. Just he and his armor bearer. The Philistines have taken over. And there's a garrison of them on the top of this hill. And here's Jonathan and just his armor bearer in the little gully below. And Jonathan just reasons, you know what? This is pretty simple, actually. Yeah, there's a bunch of them up there and there's just two of us. But they're not supposed to be there because this is land God gave us, not them. And he turns to his armor bearer and he says, what do you think? And his armor bearer says, whatever you say, let's do it. And so they put this little test out, and God makes it clear that he wants them to go. And the two of them scramble up the hill and whoop the whole garrison. Now, question, was it because Jonathan was so skilled at arms? No. God was simply looking for someone that would trust him. It was God that defeated that garrison. Think of Gideon. He going against the usurpers that have come into the land. The call goes out. We're going to fight these guys. Thousands turn out, and God says, too many. Because if you win with that number, they'll think it's because of their numbers. I want to get the glory out of this. And so he's whittled down to how many? 300. 300 against a number that was unbelievable. And they won. Because God was just looking for one man, one person to stand up. I think about little David running at Goliath across that valley. Note the words there at the end of verse 32. It says they will do great exploits. But notice that the words great exploits are in italics. That means those words are added by the translators. In Hebrew, it's this. Those who know their God shall stand firm and do greatness. As we end, I want to ask you to picture David standing with the army of Israel when Goliath issued his challenge. We go there. We go to the Valley of Elah. We were just there a couple of months ago. So I can picture this. It's one of those few places in Israel, but when you go, you can see the story. We get there and we read the text, and you can see it spelled out. Let me paint the picture for you. Join me. There's a hill. It's about half the height of Spanish Hills. And that's where the army of Israel is standing. They're on this hill on one side. Now picture this valley, about this, almost like the Oxnard Plain here, at the base of the hill, stretching to just a little bit past where the freeway is. And picture another hill about the same height. You got it? The Philistines are on that hill. So Israel on one hill, the Philistines on the other. There's a little valley between them. And every day, in the morning and in the late afternoon, this beast of a man, 9 feet tall, dressed like a tank. He strolls from the Philistine hill across the valley. He stands at the base of the hill that the armies of Israel are on, and he issues his challenge. Send me a man. We'll do representative battle. Whoever wins, their people become the masters of the others who become their slaves. And then nobody steps forward, so he starts cursing. Well, your God must be pretty weak. You guys are pathetic. Your God's pathetic. He starts blaspheming. You got the picture? Here's David. He's too young to be in the army. He lives in a village not far away, the village of Bethlehem. And one day his dad says, hey, go check and see how your older brothers who are in the army are faring. Hey, take them some food. So he gives them some pizzas. And here comes David now. So David comes out and, hey, where are my brothers? And he gets directed to where they are and gives the food off. And while David is there kind of looking at the army and what's going on, here comes Goliath. Comes across to the bottom of the other hill and he issues his challenge. And David is like, who's going to go? And he looks around and all the guys are like, not me. Have you seen that guy? And David says, so what? Who cares? Who cares how big he is? He was stunned that no one would step up. And if no one would, he would. You see, it was very simple for David. Please hear me. He knew God. Because as a young man tending his father's flock, he had many hours alone with his flock, and he pondered God. He had read his word. He knew his word. He knew God, not about him, knew him, because he had spent many hours as he watched his flock, and he began to realize that just as he was a shepherd to this flock, God was his shepherd. The Lord is I shall not. He makes me to lie down in, even though I walk through the valley of the. See, you know it. Do you know him? Do you know your shepherd? David did. And because he knew God. While the men of Israel were measuring themselves against Goliath, David measured Goliath against God and said, it's no contest. David knew that the land that the Philistines were occupying, that hill, was land that God had given to Israel. And he knew that the blasphemies that Goliath were uttering needed to be silenced. And he understood that God wanted to use someone to put a halt to it all. And then there's this. David knew that God could give him victory over Goliath because he had already given him victory over dangerous predators that had attacked the flock that he was responsible for watching. Friends, please hear me. God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things so that when they are done, God gets the glory. And ordinary people step into that extraordinary because they've been faithful in the ordinary, lesser challenges of life. You and I will not stand firm and resist in the face of persecution when we give in to the smaller temptations of anger and lust and greed. We won't be doing great deeds of faithfulness when we aren't being faithful in our daily responsibilities. Before you and I can face Goliath, we need to overcome the lions and the bears of our own flesh. The next day, when Goliath strolled across the valley, David went out to meet him. Are you picturing it? The text tells us that As here comes Goliath across that valley, David sees him, and David takes off. He goes down that hillside, and at the base of the hill, there is a brook. And it says that he stopped and he picked up some smooth stones. This stone is from that brook. I picked it up when we were there years ago to remind me that God does not need great people. He needs people who believe in a great God. Ordinary people. And then as Goliath came, he saw this little boy coming at him. 9 feet beast, professional soldier with the latest in the technology of weaponry. And here comes David in a tunic with a sling. 5'3", or however tall he was. Redhead with freckles. Young kid. And what does David say? Goliath says, am I a dog that you have come out against me like this? Come to me, little boy, and I will give you to the birds of the field. And here's what David said. I don't know about you, but I picture that scene. If that's me, I wrestled in high school, and I wrestled some guys that felt like Goliath. And I was not, trash talking. I was like, listen to David's words. You come to me with a sword and a spear. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And you know the rest of the story. And they say history is boring. In many ways, our time parallels the time of the Maccabees. The pressure is on us to compromise with and accommodate ourselves to the world. The idol of secularism has replaced the cross of Jesus Christ. Unlike the Maccabees, we do not wield an iron sword to slay our enemies. This is not our weapon. May I say, we have much better gear. We have the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God. And this is far more powerful than this. Because in this is the power of God to save. We don't slay our enemies. We get a much better victory. We win them to our side through the gospel of Jesus Christ. In battle, which is better, to kill the enemy or bring the enemy onto your side? That's our mission. That's our task. And God is looking for us to use what we know about him to stand up and say, no, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.